and InfoWars crew can't stop talking about what Brainforce does for them. Rob Dew took Brainforce and was able to work throughout the entire evening editing the Louis Farrakhan interview. He's talked about that before. Unlike some energy drinks and supplements, Brainforce uses natural brain activation ingredients like L-theanine and alpha-GPC, and it works. I've taken it, Rob Dew's taken it, we've spoken about how it produced fantastic results for us. Go and read the independent reviews at InfoWarsStore.com. And again, this all goes to support this network. You've seen how much we've improved in terms of our coverage, in terms of our aggressiveness, getting out there in the arena over the past 6 months or so, getting these confrontations, getting these social justice warriors on tape. It's really proven effective. We've really broken new ground, and it's thanks to you getting the products at InfoWarsStore.com. Now, there's a breaking story up on Drudge Report, which is incredibly concerning. We're tracking this right now. CNN reports shooting reported at Munich shopping mall. Now, remember, we had the Axe attack in Germany just a few days ago. Thankfully, nobody died. Several people critically injured, again, from a migrant, from a jihadist. He chanted Allah Akbar as he hacked at these people on a train in Germany. Now, CNN reports gunfire rang out at a shopping mall in the German city of Munich on Friday evening, prompting a large law enforcement response to what one police spokesperson said was a, quote, shooting spree. The shooting, reported about 6 p.m. local time at the Olympia shopping mall, is over, thankfully. Police spokeswoman Claudia Kvensil said there was no immediate information about injuries or deaths. Lynn Steen, who said she works at the Jack Wolfskin store in the mall, told CNN that the shooter was inside the mall. Quote, I heard several shots. Steen said, I was just going to buy something while my co-worker was still at the shop. People started running. I went outside as well, more people running outside. She said she heard several shots. That's a breaking story. There's more to come. Hopefully, you know, they've neutralized the shooter and nobody's died. Obviously, it sounds like some people have been injured. But again, that is breaking right now. It's up on the Drudge Report if you want to check that out. Final comment on what I was talking about before the break. Again, liberals will completely abandon their principles when it suits them and then still claim the moral high ground. Anna Kasparian is still claiming that she was in the right to say this to Alex Jones, even though it exposes her as a complete hypocrite. We've also got this, which is related. A Guardian journalist tweeted some of the, quote, nastiest and, let's be honest, sexist Hillary badges on sale at the RNC. There are some pictures of these up on Twitter. One of them says, life's a bitch, don't vote for one, referring, of course, to Hillary Clinton. Another one says, KFC Hillary special, 2 fat thighs, 2 small breasts, left wing. So again, it's okay to call Trump a fascist, a racist, and literally Hitler, but Hillary Clinton can't handle being called a bitch. Again, complete double standards. We'll be back on the Alex Jones Show after the break. We're back. Alex Jones Show live. We're talking about that breaking news at Munich. Now, AFP reports 1 dead, 10 injured in shooting at Munich shopping centre. Unfortunately, it looks like at least 1 is dead. Other sources are reporting several deaths. So unfortunately, it looks like there have been some fatalities. Also, ISIS-linked Twitter accounts are already celebrating the attack. Now, this is interesting because, you know, we had the Axe attack in Germany a few days ago. Last week, I was on the Alex Jones Show saying that when these attacks start happening in Germany, that's when you will see what kind of response the German people will have. Now, we don't know the identity of the attacker. They could blame it on some right-winger and use that for their own purposes. It could be an ISIS jihadist. It could be one of these migrants that's been radicalized that's come into Germany. You know, over 1.1 million of them over the past year. We don't know the details of the perpetrator. But again, we had the attack, which I've talked about before, right after the Paris massacre, where it was a football match between France and Germany. They closed the stadium down. They called off the match because they found this fake ambulance full of explosives. Now, at the time, the German government came out and said, this was all a hoax, nothing happened, don't worry about it, contradicting police and ambulance workers, EMTs, who said that the explosives were real and that the German government covered up this attack. So again, it's going to be interesting how this pans out. Unfortunately, it's looking like there are some fatalities. And you know, as I said a couple of days ago on Facebook, most people had forgotten about the Nice massacre a week after it happened. Let's remind ourselves, that only happened 8 days ago. A week later, people had basically forgotten about it. They'd moved on to the next thing. We can't allow this to become the new normal in Europe. We have to face up to this situation. We have to resolve the problem. We have to look at this policy of just letting millions of unassimilated migrants into Europe with no actual policy to integrate them. This has led to violence. It led to the Axe attack. Again, Afghan refugee. He'd been in the country a couple of years, radicalized, went Allah Akbar and started hacking up tourists on a German train. So we'll see who they blame this shooting on. But again, breaking news, AFP reports 1 dead, 10 injured. We'll continue to track it. But for this hour, for most of it anyway, we're joined by a regular guest, although she hasn't been on for a while, Syrian girl who is a geopolitical analyst and contributor for the New Eastern Outlook, because, of course, we had this horrific video that came out a couple of days ago, which I actually watched in full. I wouldn't recommend anyone to do the same, where this young boy was beheaded by this rebel group backed by the Obama administration. It looked like this would have consequences for the US's involvement in Syria, but whether that's true or not remains to be seen. Syrian girl, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be back here. It's been a while.
It's been a while, but we've had this big news again in Syria this week. It's really come back into focus. Before we get into the aftermath of, you know, how the media is twisting the narrative on this beheading, just walk us through this tragic sequence of events that led to the murder of this young boy in Aleppo.
I, commiserate with you because I also watched the horrifying video of this child getting beheaded and also laughed at by one of the CIA's moderate vetted rebels. And the sequence goes really back to 2011 and 2012 when many governments, not just the US government, but also NATO European governments, including France, started openly arming rebel groups. Hollande, he in 2012 openly said, yes, I'm arming these rebel groups in Syria. The CIA, apparently this particular group that did this beheading was CIA trained. And in March of 2015, the NATO-run media was complaining that Russia was bombing this group, CIA-trained, vetted, moderate rebel group. And the most interesting thing, in these last 3 years is that they've been telling us that there's moderates and there's terrorists. There's the moderate rebels that they're arming, which are vetted and very nice. And then there's the terrible, terrible ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which every single massacre, though of course ISIS and Al-Qaeda commit numerous massacres and acts of terrorism, but every single one, they're just waved off as acts of ISIS, but not protected moderates. But now the moderates have proved to be worse than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And in fact, in the newly out video of the translation of the beheading, this moderate CIA-trained group said, we are worse than ISIS. You should see how brutal we are. That was just before they beheaded the child. So, it comes to now the point where we can prove that the US State Department, Obama, and his whole administration, including Clinton, put guns and taxpayers' money in the arms of something that is worse than ISIS. So I wonder, when is it there going to be some legal repercussions to that? Not only because it's against the US law and is basically an act of treason, but also in the international law, because of course, if you're going to give weapons to terrorists, that is a crime. And the thing is, in 2011, Syria went through a very similar thing where the first terror attack happened and hundreds of people died, or 50 people died, and everyone was shocked that this is something that never happened in Syria before. And, it was international news. It was obviously in the news in Syria a lot. But after, some time, and the same with Iraq, you get bombing after bombing after bombing. And then this idea develops that, well, Syria, bombings just happen in Syria and people just die there. So we shouldn't really, worry about it. And maybe it was like that all along. When, I see basically what you said in your introduction, that now 80 people died and it's just like nothing happened. The same thing is happening in Europe. This is all connected. It didn't happen in a vacuum. These attacks are happening numerously. And the alternative media, including myself and the InfoWars program, said that this would happen as a result of the US foreign policy during the Arab Spring of giving arms to basically the most extreme, brutal, criminal elements inside the Middle East and North Africa. This was all predicted, and it's happening before our eyes. But unfortunately, because a lot of people remain, uninformed or fail to make the connections, instead of getting to the crux of the argument, to the real problem, we're getting misdirected. They've always intended to create this clash of civilizations. However, while some events that are happening may be disconnected from the geopolitical situation, I think a lot of them can be connected. The first attack that happened in France in November, I'm not sure if it was the first, but the one that happened in November, the day before that, Hollande had sent a carrier to Syria to, conduct attacks a day in advance of the attack. And then when the terrorist attack happened, he then said, well, now I'm going to get more involved in Syria. The same sequence of events occurred in the last Nice attack. Hollande said a day before that he has sent a carrier to Syria, and then the next day the attack happened. And it's interesting that in November, this attack was tied back to Syria with the use of a fake Syrian passport that police admitted was planted at the scene. And what I see a lot, in the media is reports come out of people saying, the Syrian refugees did this or Syrian refugees did that. And it turns out to be either, Sudanese or Somalian or Tunisian or Moroccan and Algerian and, everything else. There was one report, about the rape of a 5-year-old that, turned out not to be.
I mean, this is the problem. Syrian girl, there's no distinction between actual Syrian refugees, and we made this point from the very beginning, and the waves, which is the vast majority of them, of economic migrants and actual terrorists who exploited that whole program to come over to Europe. Even the mastermind of the Paris attacks in ISIS's own manifesto bragged that he had exploited this migrant wave to carry out these attacks. So this is happening. Again, like you said, there's a distinction between Syrian refugees and terrorists, as well as economic migrants that are exploiting this program. Getting back to the beheading, though, again, this was completely indefensible, and yet we saw in the aftermath, yet again, the beheading of this boy. The neocons, the neolibs, tried to make excuses for it anyway. Explain how they tried to twist the narrative after the beheading of this boy.
The way that they twisted the narrative is insane. But just to wrap up, just my last point, the point is that the word refugee has become synonymous with Syrians. So a lot of reports of people that have had bad things happen to them might accidentally say that, it was a Syrian. I'm not saying that Syrians aren't capable, but as we saw with the beheadings, if those people were to be allowed into Europe, then, they exist. There is this bad element everywhere, and specifically after they've been armed and radicalized by the CIA in Syria. But the point that I'm trying to make is they want this because they want to somehow tie it back into their regime change agenda. And the terrorist attacks, I'm sure that the European governments were counting on them because they are a way to legitimize their bombing campaigns. And as we can see, they're doing two things at the same time. They're saying they're fighting ISIS and they're giving it guns. They're saying let in the immigrants and they're saying the immigrants are all terrorists. So it's basically they're creating a scenario where two sides are going to clash.
Okay, and we'll be back after the break. But again, the point is, don't overthrow secular governments and armed jihadists in the first place. That's what caused this mess from the very beginning. That's why we were against it. We'll be back with more from Syrian Girl in the next segment. This is the Alex Jones Show Live, Infowars.com. We'll be